Lorraine, France, September 20th, 1944, 1100 hours, and Hauptmann Werner Kleist, commanding the 2nd Company, 113th Panzer Brigade, watched his column of 17 Panther tanks advance through the morning fog toward the French town of Arracourt, completely unaware that above the cloud layer at 1,500 feet, Major Charles Carpenter in his fabric-covered Piper L-4 Grasshopper was already radioing his position to 3 battalions of American 105mm howitzers that would have rounds on target in less than 3 minutes. The German tank commander had dismissed the reports of the small observation planes his men called Storch wannabes, after their own Fieseler Fi 156 Storch, these American Piper L-4 Grasshoppers that looked more like toys than military aircraft, believing them to be nothing more than reconnaissance planes that posed no direct threat to his 60-ton Panthers with their thick sloped armor and powerful 75mm guns, not understanding that these slow-moving 65-horsepower aircraft with their maximum speed of 75 miles per hour had become the most devastating forward observation platforms in military history, capable of bringing down coordinated artillery fire from multiple battalions within 3 minutes of target identification, a response time that German artillery, still using World War I methods of registration and adjustment, could never match with their 10 to 12-minute fire mission procedures. The morning fog that had given Kleist such confidence, believing it would mask his approach from American ground observers, meant nothing to the L-4 Grasshopper pilots who simply climbed above it, and when the fog began to lift around noon, Carpenter spotted the German column immediately, diving through intense ground fire to get a better look at the 17 Panthers advancing in tactical formation toward Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, his voice crackling over the SCR 610 radio, as he called in the coordinates to the Fire Direction Center, where American artillery officers using pre-computed firing tables and mechanical calculating devices could have rounds in the air within 90 seconds of receiving the call for fire. The Wehrmacht's artillery doctrine, developed during the Great War and refined only marginally since then, required forward observers on the ground to relay information through multiple command levels, with calculations done manually at battery positions, registration shots fired for adjustment, and only then could the main barrage begin, a process that even under ideal conditions took 10 to 12 minutes, but the Americans had revolutionized artillery warfare with their fire direction centers where every gun in the division could be coordinated from a single point, where pre-plotted coordinates covered every piece of terrain in the operational area, where mechanical computers calculated firing solutions in seconds, and where any American soldier, not just trained artillery observers, could call for fire using simple grid references. Kleist's counterpart in the Imperial Japanese Army, Colonel Takashi Yamada, commanding an artillery regiment on Saipan 3 months earlier, had written in his final report before the American invasion that the appearance of the American L-4 Grasshoppers over Japanese positions had completely paralyzed his artillery batteries, forcing them to remain silent or face immediate counter-battery fire that would arrive within minutes of them opening fire, stating that his men feared the small observation planes more than the American fighters and bombers because the L-4 meant that devastating artillery fire would follow within minutes, not the 30 to 40 minutes it took Japanese artillery to respond to fire missions. The Italian artillery commander, Colonnello Giuseppe Benedetti, who had survived the Sicily campaign in 1943, had reported similar experiences to German liaison officers, describing how the American L-4 Grasshoppers had made daylight movement impossible, that Italian artillery batteries were destroyed within minutes of revealing their positions, that the constant presence of the small aircraft overhead had broken the morale of his gunners, who knew that firing meant certain death from the rain of American shells that would arrive before they could even relocate their guns, experiences that German commanders like Kleist had dismissed as Italian exaggeration and defeatism, not understanding that the Americans had created an artillery system where the observer, the fire direction center, and the guns were linked by FM radios in a synchronized ballet of destruction that could mask the fires of an entire corps artillery on a single target within minutes. The evolution of American artillery spotting had begun in North Africa, where the first L-4 Grasshoppers proved their worth despite initial skepticism from both the Army Air Forces, who considered them too vulnerable, and the ground forces, who doubted their effectiveness. But by Sicily in 1943, each field artillery battalion had 2 L-4 aircraft organic to its structure, pilots who were artillery officers first and aviators second, men who understood the technical aspects of indirect fire, who could adjust rounds while flying their aircraft, who developed techniques for surviving in the hostile airspace over the battlefield by flying low and using terrain for cover, popping up just long enough to spot targets and adjust fire before diving back to safety. The German Luftwaffe had initially ignored these small aircraft, considering them beneath notice compared to the fighters and bombers they were tasked with intercepting. But by 1944, specific orders had been issued to attack L-4 Grasshoppers on sight, though the nimble little aircraft proved surprisingly difficult to shoot down, their slow speed allowing them to turn inside any fighter that attacked them, their ability to land and take off from any piece of flat ground making them impossible to trap at fixed airfields, their pilots becoming expert at using terrain and weather to avoid interception, developing tactics where they would fly just above the treetops, using hills and valleys for cover, only climbing when necessary to observe targets. Major Charles Carpenter himself had modified his L-4 Grasshopper with 6 M1A1 bazookas mounted on the wing struts, turning his observation plane into what he called a tank hunter, though on this day over Arracourt he was performing the traditional observation role, watching as the first 105mm rounds impacted among Kleist's Panthers, the accuracy stunning even by American standards as the first salvo bracketed the column, the second salvo scoring direct hits on 3 tanks, the third turning the orderly German advance into chaos as Panthers attempted to scatter but found themselves in pre-plotted kill zones where American artillery had already calculated the exact firing data for every piece of ground. The German tank crews had been trained to fear American fighter bombers, the dreaded P-47 Thunderbolts that could destroy a tank with rockets or bombs, but they had not been prepared for the devastating accuracy of artillery directed by an observer who could see their every movement, who could walk rounds from one tank to another with the precision of a sniper, who could call in the combined fires of multiple battalions to create a steel rain that turned the ground into a moonscape of craters and burning vehicles, the L-4 Grasshopper circling overhead like a vulture, untouchable at its altitude, its pilot calmly reporting the destruction below as German tankers abandoned their vehicles and fled into the woods only to find that the American artillery could reach them there too, tree bursts turning the forest into a death trap of spinning steel fragments. The mathematics of modern artillery warfare were brutally simple yet beyond the comprehension of German commanders still thinking in World War I terms where artillery was an area weapon fired in mass barges at grid squares. But the Americans had turned artillery into a precision instrument where forward observers equipped with specialized equipment could provide accurate target locations, where fire direction centers using graphical firing tables and mechanical computers could calculate exact firing solutions in seconds, where every gun in a division could be brought to bear on a single target within 3 minutes of the initial call for fire, where the observer could adjust rounds in real time, walking them onto targets with an accuracy that seemed impossible to German officers watching their units disappear under the rain of steel. Hauptmann Kleist, his command tank burning from a direct hit, tried to rally his remaining Panthers, ordering them to advance at maximum speed to close with the American positions where the artillery couldn't engage them without hitting their own troops. But the L-4 overhead tracked their every movement, Carpenter's calm voice directing the artillery to shift targets, calling in new concentrations as the German tanks maneuvered, requesting white phosphorus rounds to mark targets for the fighter bombers that were already being vectored in, the entire American combined arms system working with a synchronization that the Wehrmacht, despite its reputation for military efficiency, had never achieved. The Japanese experience at Saipan had been even more devastating, where Colonel Yamada's artillery regiment faced not one but dozens of L-4 Grasshoppers operating from captured airfields and even from escort carriers offshore, the small aircraft maintaining constant surveillance over Japanese positions, making any movement in daylight suicidal, forcing Japanese artillery to fire only at night and even then for only brief periods before American counter-battery fire guided by sound ranging. Equipment and flash spotting would rain down on their positions, the psychological effect as devastating as the physical destruction. Japanese gunners refusing to fire even when American infantry was advancing in the open because they knew that revealing their position meant certain death within minutes. The Italian experience in Sicily had been similar, where Colonnello Benedetti's artillery batteries had been systematically destroyed by American counter-battery fire directed by L-4 Grasshoppers, the Italian gunners developing a fatalistic attitude, knowing that every time they fired they were signing their own death warrants, some batteries simply abandoning their guns rather than face the inevitable American response, the breakdown in Italian artillery support contributing significantly to the rapid collapse of Axis resistance on the island, lessons that should have been learned by the Germans but were dismissed as the failures of inferior allies rather than brazenizing the revolutionary nature of American artillery tactics. The technical specifications of the L-4 Grasshopper seemed almost laughable compared to the powerful fighters and bombers of 1944, with its Continental S-65 engine producing just 65 horsepower, its maximum speed of 75 miles per hour making it slower than World War I fighters, its fabric-covered steel tube fuselage and wooden propellers seeming like something from aviation's pioneer days, its maximum ceiling of 12,000 feet barely half that of contemporary fighters, its range of 220 miles limiting it to battlefield observation. Yet these apparent limitations were actually advantages in the observation role, the slow speed allowing pilots to loiter over targets for hours, the simple construction making field repairs easy with the most basic tools, the ability to operate from any flat piece of ground 600 feet long making elaborate airfields unnecessary, the low ceiling keeping the aircraft below the effective engagement envelope of most anti-aircraft guns designed to engage high-flying bombers. The L-4's pilots, artillery officers who had completed abbreviated flight training, developed techniques specific to their mission, learning to fly figure-8 patterns over enemy positions to maintain constant observation while making themselves difficult targets for ground fire, using the sun to blind anti-aircraft gunners, exploiting weather conditions that grounded other aircraft, flying at treetop level to avoid detection then popping up just long enough to observe and adjust fire, becoming so proficient that they could simultaneously fly their aircraft, observe enemy positions, calculate adjustments, and communicate with fire direction centers, a level of multitasking that amazed even experienced aviators. The German Wehrmacht had actually possessed a similar aircraft in the Fieseler Fi-156 Storch, an outstanding observation plane with exceptional short takeoff and landing capabilities, better performance than the L-4 Grasshopper, and excellent visibility from its extensively glazed cockpit, but the German military mindset had never fully grasped the potential of organic artillery observation aircraft, using the Storch primarily for liaison and command transportation rather than as a dedicated artillery spotter, and even when German artillery officers recognized the value of aerial observation, the complex German command structure with its rigid separation between the Luftwaffe and the Army made it impossible to assign aircraft directly to artillery units the way the Americans had done, creating bureaucratic delays that made rapid response impossible. The few attempts to employ the Storch in the observation role were hampered by the lack of effective radio communications between aircraft and artillery batteries, the absence of efficient fire direction procedures, the shortage of trained observer pilots, and most critically, the growing Allied air superiority that made it suicidal for the slow Storch to operate over the battlefield, problems that the Americans had solved through organizational innovation, technical development, and most importantly, the integration of air observation into the artillery system from the beginning rather than as an afterthought. As the destruction of Kleist's Panzer Company continued beneath him, Major Carpenter in his L-4 Grasshopper noted the arrival of additional German armored vehicles attempting to reinforce the battered unit, immediately calling for a shift in artillery priority. His calm professional voice betraying no emotion as he directed devastating fire onto the new targets, the American artillery responding with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, rounds impacting within minutes of his call. The German reinforcements caught in the open with nowhere to hide, their commanders frantically trying to understand how the Americans could respond so quickly, how their artillery could be so accurate without registration shots, how a single small aircraft could orchestrate such destruction. The psychological impact on German troops was profound, knowing that any time they heard the distinctive puttering sound of the L-4's small engine overhead, death could rain down within minutes, faster than they could take cover, faster than their own artillery could respond to requests for counter-battery fire, faster than their anti-aircraft guns could engage the nimble little aircraft that seemed to dance through their fire unharmed, creating a sense of helplessness that eroded morale more effectively than any propaganda, German soldiers developing an almost superstitious fear of the L-4 Grasshoppers, calling them Himmelstad or death from heaven, not for what they could do directly but for the artillery storm they could summon. The Battle of Arracourt would see the destruction of 200 German tanks out of the 262 committed, a catastrophic loss rate that ended any hope of stopping Patton's Third Army in Lorraine, with L-4 Grasshopper pilots credited with directing artillery fire that accounted for a significant percentage of the German losses, their ability to spot German tanks attempting to use terrain for cover, to track moving targets and vector artillery onto them, to maintain surveillance even in poor weather conditions when other aircraft were grounded, proving decisive in what became the largest tank battle on the Western Front until the Battle of the Bulge. The German after-action reports, those that survived, expressed bewilderment at the speed and accuracy of American artillery response. Officers writing that it seemed as if the Americans could read their minds, that every movement was immediately countered by artillery fire, that attempted concentrations for counterattacks were broken up before they could begin, not understanding that the L-4 Grasshoppers orbiting overhead were providing American commanders with real-time intelligence that allowed them to see and react to German movements faster than the Germans themselves could execute them. The observe, orient, decide, act loop compressed to minutes rather than hours. In the Pacific Theater, similar scenes played out on islands from Saipan to Okinawa, where Japanese commanders reported that the appearance of L-4 Grasshoppers paralyzed their forces. Colonel Yamada writing in his diary before his death on Saipan that the small American observation planes had made traditional artillery tactics impossible, that his batteries could not provide support to infantry attacks without being immediately destroyed by counter-battery fire, that the constant surveillance made even simple logistics movements deadly, that his men had begun to refuse orders to fire, knowing it meant certain death, the breakdown of Japanese artillery support contributing to the increasingly desperate and ultimately suicidal banzai charges that characterized the final stages of island battles. On Okinawa, Japanese artillery hidden in caves and reverse slope positions, tactics that had proven effective against ground observers, found themselves still vulnerable to L-4 Grasshoppers that could observe their muzzle flashes from angles impossible for ground observers. American artillery systematically sealing cave entrances and destroying concealed positions with an accuracy that seemed supernatural to Japanese defenders who had thought their positions impregnable. The psychological impact so severe that some Japanese artillery units simply abandoned their guns rather than face the inevitable American response. The Italian campaign had demonstrated similar patterns, where German forces fighting alongside Italian units witnessed firsthand the devastating effectiveness of American artillery observation. Wehrmacht officers reporting that Italian artillery batteries would cease firing the moment L-4 Grasshoppers appeared overhead, creating gaps in defensive fire plans that American forces exploited ruthlessly, the Germans attempting to compensate with their own artillery but finding themselves equally vulnerable to the American observation system, their longer fire mission times meaning that by the time German artillery responded to American attacks, the tactical situation had already changed, the Americans had already moved, and the German rounds fell on empty ground while American counter-battery fire guided by L-4s destroyed the German guns that had just revealed their positions. The cumulative effect was a fundamental shift in the nature of ground combat, where traditional concepts of cover and concealment became meaningless when enemy observers could see everything from above, where artillery could strike with the accuracy of a sniper rifle and the power of a battleship's broadside, where the time between detection and destruction was measured in minutes rather than hours, creating a battlefield where speed of response mattered more than weight of fire, where integration of combined arms mattered more than individual weapon superiority, where organizational innovation mattered more than tactical tradition. The production statistics told their own story of American industrial mobilization and organizational commitment to the artillery observation mission, with Piper Aircraft Corporation manufacturing 20,038 L-4 variants between 1938 and 1947, reaching a peak production rate of one aircraft every 20 minutes, each one representing not just an airplane but a complete observation system when combined with trained pilots, radio equipment, and integration into the artillery command structure. The sheer numbers overwhelming any attempt by Axis forces to counter them through interception or anti-aircraft fire, ensuring that American forces always had observation aircraft available regardless of losses. The training pipeline produced thousands of artillery officers qualified as L-4 pilots, men who understood both the technical aspects of artillery and the skills needed to survive in the hostile airspace over the battlefield, developing doctrine and tactics that maximize the aircraft's strengths while minimizing its vulnerabilities, creating an institutional knowledge base that improved effectiveness with each campaign, lessons learned in North Africa applied in Sicily, refined in Italy, perfected in France, and adapted for the unique conditions of the Pacific Theater. Hauptmann Kleist, wounded and captured after his tank was destroyed, would later tell interrogators that the appearance of L-4 Grasshoppers had made traditional German armored tactics impossible, that the ability to mass tanks for breakthrough attacks was negated when American artillery could engage them within minutes of concentration, that the famous German combined arms coordination between tanks and infantry broke down when supporting infantry could be separated from tanks by artillery barges directed with pinpoint accuracy from above, that the psychological impact on his men of knowing they were under constant observation, that death could come at any moment from an enemy they couldn't see or fight, had been more demoralizing than facing American tanks or infantry in direct combat. His observations were echoed by other German officers captured during the Lorraine campaign, men who had fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, who had faced the British in North Africa, who thought they had seen everything modern warfare could offer, but who were stunned by the speed and precision of American artillery directed by L-4 Grasshoppers, comparing it to fighting an enemy who could see in the dark, who could reach out and touch them at will, who had compressed the sensor shooter loop to a degree that seemed to violate the laws of military physics as they understood them. The Japanese military, studying German reports and their own experiences, attempted to develop countermeasures, experimenting with camouflage techniques, dummy positions, and night movement to avoid L-4 observation, but found that American innovation kept pace with their adaptations. The introduction of white phosphorus marking rounds that could designate targets for fighter bombers even through smoke screens, the use of sound-ranging equipment that could locate artillery even when L-4s couldn't observe directly, the development of time-on-target techniques where multiple batteries fired at different times so all rounds arrived simultaneously, creating devastating surprise concentrations that gave no warning for troops to take cover. Colonel Yamada's replacement on Okinawa, Major Hiroshi Tanaka, wrote in his final report that fighting American artillery directed by L-4 Grasshoppers was like fighting ghosts, that his men could hear the aircraft overhead but couldn't engage them effectively with anti-aircraft fire, that they would see the muzzle flashes of American guns on the horizon and know that in seconds death would arrive, that the constant stress of being under observation, of knowing that any movement could trigger an artillery barrage, had driven some of his men insane, others to desert, and ultimately contributed to the collapse of organized resistance despite the Japanese tradition of fighting to the death. The revolution in artillery effectiveness created by the L-4 Grasshopper extended beyond mere technical capabilities to fundamentally change the nature of ground combat, where static defensive positions became death traps when observers could direct plunging fire into trenches and bunkers, where mobile operations became exercises in racing between artillery concentrations, where the traditional advantage of the defender was negated by the ability to mass fires from beyond visual range with accuracy measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters, where the fog of war was lifted for one side while the other operated in darkness, creating an asymmetric battlefield where American forces could see and strike while remaining invisible and untouchable to their enemies. The German concept of Auftragstaktik or mission-type tactics, which relied on junior commanders making independent decisions based on local conditions, broke down when those commanders could be identified and eliminated by directed artillery fire within minutes of revealing themselves, when command posts could be located by L-4 observers noting the convergence of communication wires or vehicle tracks and destroyed before they could relocate, when the traditional German flexibility and initiative was countered by an American observation and fire control system that could respond faster than German commanders could make and implement decisions. The organizational structure that made the L-4 Grasshopper system effective was as revolutionary as the technology itself, with artillery battalions organically equipped with their own aircraft and pilots, eliminating the bureaucratic delays inherent in requesting air support from separate aviation units, pilots who were artillery officers first and aviators second, understanding the technical aspects of indirect fire and able to communicate effectively with fire direction centers, maintenance, performed by artillery mechanics trained in aircraft systems, creating a self-contained observation capability that could operate independently of Air Force or Army aviation support. This organizational innovation was something the German Wehrmacht, with its rigid separation between services and branches, could never replicate even when they recognized its value, the Luftwaffe refusing to subordinate aircraft to Army control, the Army lacking the authority to procure and operate its own aircraft, creating a bureaucratic paralysis that prevented effective response to the American innovation, a perfect example of how organizational culture and structure could be as important as technology in determining military effectiveness. The fire direction center concept that made rapid artillery response possible represented a revolution in command and control that the Germans, despite their reputation for military efficiency, never fully understood or implemented. These centers where fire missions were processed using graphical firing tables, mechanical computers, and standardized procedures that allowed any battery in the division to engage any target within range within minutes of request, where multiple batteries could be coordinated to mass fires or engage multiple targets simultaneously, where observers could shift fires from target to target with simple corrections rather than complete new fire missions, where the entire artillery system of a corps could be controlled from a single point if necessary. capabilities that seemed like science fiction to German officers accustomed to battery-level fire control with manual calculations and voice communications. The American system transformed artillery from a blunt instrument of area destruction into a precise tool that could be wielded with surgical accuracy, where individual vehicles could be engaged at ranges of 10 miles or more, where targets could be engaged simultaneously by multiple batteries firing different types of ammunition for different effects, where the traditional concept of artillery preparation was replaced by continuous on-call support that could respond to tactical developments in real time. Major Carpenter's actions at Arracourt, where he directed artillery fire that stopped an entire Panzer Brigade's attack, demonstrated the multiplication of combat power achieved when a single observer aircraft could control the fires of multiple battalions, his ability to see the entire battlefield from altitude allowing him to identify and prioritize targets in a way impossible for ground observers limited by terrain and vegetation, his mobility allowing him to follow the battle as it developed rather than being fixed to a single observation point, his direct communication with fire direction centers eliminating the delays inherent in relaying information through multiple command levels. The German brigade commander, Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, reported that his attack had been doomed from the moment the L-4 appeared overhead, that his carefully planned approach using covered routes was meaningless when the American observer could see everything from above, that his tanks were picked off one by one with an accuracy that suggested the Americans knew exactly where each vehicle was at all times, that the psychological impact on his crews of being hunted by an enemy they couldn't fight back against had been devastating, men abandoning serviceable tanks rather than continue advancing under the rain of artillery fire. The Pacific Theater provided even more dramatic examples of L-4 effectiveness, where on small islands with limited maneuver room, the ability to direct accurate artillery fire became decisive, Japanese positions that had survived naval bombardment and aerial bombing succumbing to artillery directed by L-4 observers who could identify specific bunkers and cave entrances, who could adjust fire into reverse slope positions invisible to ground observers, who could track Japanese movements and break up counterattacks before they could develop, the compression of the battlefield making the speed of artillery response even more critical than in the open terrain of Europe. On Iwo Jima, L-4 pilots operated from escort carriers offshore before rough airstrips could be constructed on the island itself, flying in conditions that would have grounded other aircraft, maintaining observation despite Japanese anti-aircraft fire that claimed several aircraft, their presence allowing marine artillery to provide continuous support despite the island's volcanic ash that made ground observation difficult, their ability to spot Japanese positions in the jumbled volcanic terrain, contributing significantly to the eventual American victory despite the enormous cost in casualties. The Italian theater demonstrated the versatility of L-4 operations in mountainous terrain where ground observation was limited by topography, where traditional artillery forward observers could only see their immediate vicinity, where German defensive positions on reverse slopes and in mountain valleys were immune to observed fire from ground level, but where L-4 Grasshoppers could fly through mountain passes and valleys, observing positions invisible from any ground location, directing, plunging fire into positions the Germans thought were safe from artillery, breaking the deadlock of mountain warfare where defenders traditionally held overwhelming advantage. During the assault on the Gothic Line, L-4 observers identified German positions that had held up Allied advances for weeks, directed artillery that destroyed bunkers built into mountainsides, spotted German reserves moving through valleys to reinforce threatened sectors and brought them under fire before they could reach the front lines, their contribution so significant that German commanders credited American artillery observation as the decisive factor in breaking through defensive lines. That should have been impregnable. The maintenance and logistics system that kept L-4 Grasshoppers operational under combat conditions represented another American innovation that Axis forces couldn't match, with spare parts and maintenance equipment distributed to artillery battalions, mechanics trained in both artillery and aircraft systems, field repairs performed using improvised materials and techniques, damaged aircraft cannibalized to keep others flying, a distributed and resilient support system that ensured aircraft availability rates that seemed impossible to German and Japanese forces accustomed to centralized maintenance that created single points of failure. The simplicity of the L-4 design facilitated field maintenance. Its fabric covering could be patched with materials available in any military supply system. Its simple engine could be maintained by anyone familiar with basic automotive mechanics. Its lack of complex systems meant that most problems could be diagnosed and fixed at the unit level without specialized equipment or expertise, creating a sustainable observation capability that could operate continuously despite the attrition of combat, weather, and mechanical wear. The psychological warfare aspect of L-4 operations extended beyond their direct military effectiveness to become a tool of demoralization that affected Axis forces at every level from private soldiers to general officers, the constant presence overhead creating a sense of being watched, of vulnerability, of helplessness against an enemy that could see everything and strike at will, German soldiers developing neuroses from the stress of constant observation, Japanese troops driven to desperate measures by the knowledge that movement meant death, Italian forces simply refusing to fight when L-4s appeared overhead, morale collapsing not from direct combat losses but from the psychological pressure of fighting an enemy with seemingly godlike powers of observation and retribution. Veterans interviewed after the war consistently rated the fear of L-4 directed artillery as equal to or greater than their fear of direct combat. The random nature of death from above, the inability to fight back, the knowledge that safety was an illusion when observers could peer into any hiding place, creating a combat stress unique to fighting against American forces with their integrated artillery observation system. The training doctrine developed for L-4 pilots emphasized survival as much as observation skills, teaching pilots to fly at treetop level using terrain for concealment, to climb only when necessary for observation, to use weather and lighting conditions to their advantage, to vary their patterns to avoid becoming predictable targets for anti-aircraft guns, to coordinate with fighter aircraft for protection when operating in areas of enemy air activity, to understand the capabilities and limitations of enemy anti-aircraft weapons and exploit their weaknesses, creating a cadre of pilots who could operate effectively in the hostile airspace over the battlefield, while maintaining the observation coverage essential to American artillery effectiveness. The abbreviated flight training program, designed to produce artillery observers who could fly rather than pilots who understood artillery, proved remarkably effective, with artillery officers learning basic flying skills in a matter of weeks rather than the months required for traditional pilot training, their existing knowledge of artillery observation, map reading, and fire adjustment allowing them to focus on the mechanical skills of flying rather than having to learn both aviation and artillery simultaneously. The intelligence gathered by L-4 observers extended beyond simple artillery spotting to become a critical component of American battlefield intelligence. Pilots reporting on enemy movements, identifying supply routes and depots, locating command posts and communication centers, providing real-time tactical intelligence that allowed American commanders to make informed decisions based on current information rather than relying on outdated reports or assumptions, the mobility and altitude of L-4. Observations providing a perspective on the battlefield that no amount of ground reconnaissance could match. This intelligence capability was particularly valuable in fluid situations where the front lines were unclear, where enemy and friendly forces were intermixed, where traditional reconnaissance methods were too dangerous or time-consuming, L-4 pilots becoming the eyes of division and corps commanders, their reports often determining the course of battles, their observations preventing American forces from walking into ambushes or attacking positions already abandoned by the enemy. The communication systems that linked L-4 observers to fire direction centers and command posts represented another area of American technical superiority. FM radios that provided clear voice communications despite battlefield interference, standardized procedures and terminology that minimized confusion and delays, redundant communication paths that ensured messages got through even when primary channels were jammed or disrupted, encryption systems that prevented enemy interception of fire, missions, creating a secure and reliable communication network that functioned effectively despite the chaos of combat. German attempts to jam American artillery communications were largely unsuccessful, the frequency hopping capabilities of American FM radios defeating German jamming equipment designed for AM frequencies, the distributed nature of the communication network meaning that jamming one frequency or location simply caused traffic to shift to alternatives, the Americans always seeming to be one step ahead in the electronic warfare battle that paralleled the physical combat on the ground. As the Battle of Arracourt concluded with the destruction of German armored reserves that were supposed to stop Patton's advance toward the Rhine, the full impact of the L-4 Grasshopper system became clear to German high command. Intelligence reports describing an American artillery observation system that had revolutionized ground combat, that had negated traditional German advantages in armor and tactical doctrine, that had created a killing ground where German forces were hunted from above with no effective counter, recommendations for developing similar capabilities dismissed as impossible given German organizational structure and resource constraints. The recognition that they were fighting not just American material superiority but American organizational and doctrinal innovation that leveraged that material into decisive battlefield advantage. Field Marshal Walter Model, reviewing the reports from Lorraine, commented that the Americans had achieved what German military theorists had only dreamed of, the ability to see the battlefield as a whole and strike any point on it within minutes, comparing it to fighting an enemy who could read your thoughts and counter your moves before you made them, admitting that traditional German military doctrine had no answer to this new form of warfare. The Japanese military attaché in Berlin, studying German reports and comparing them to Japanese experiences in the Pacific, cabled Tokyo that the American artillery observation system represented a revolution in military affairs comparable to the introduction of gunpowder or the machine gun, that traditional defensive tactics were obsolete when the enemy could observe everything from above and strike within minutes, that the only defense was to prevent the Americans from establishing air superiority and forward airfields from which L-4 Grasshoppers could operate, but by 1944 it was already too late, American industrial production and pilot training programs ensuring that losses were immediately replaced, that every American division would have its organic artillery observation, that the revolution in ground combat effectiveness was irreversible. The Italian military, what remained of it after the armistice, simply accepted that modern warfare had passed them by, that they lacked the industrial base, the organizational capability, and the technical expertise to compete with American innovations, their only contribution to Axis understanding of the L-4 threat being detailed reports of their own destruction that German commanders had largely ignored until experiencing it themselves. The cost-effectiveness of the L-4 Grasshopper system stunned German analysts, who calculated that a single $3,000 aircraft flown by one pilot could direct artillery fire that destroyed millions of dollars worth of German tanks and equipment, that the entire L-4 program cost less than a single German Tiger II tank while providing battlefield effectiveness that no number of heavy tanks could match, that American investment in organizational innovation and integrated systems had provided far greater return than German investment in wonder weapons and super tanks that were impressive individually but ineffective against an enemy who could destroy them from beyond visual range within minutes of detection. The German focus on technical superiority of individual weapons, the Tiger and Panther tanks with their powerful guns and thick armor, the Me-262 jet fighter with its revolutionary performance, the V weapons with their strategic reach, had blinded them to the American focus on systematic superiority, the integration of adequate weapons into superior systems, the multiplication of combat power through organization and doctrine rather than technology alone. Major Carpenter himself, who would be credited with destroying 6 enemy tanks with his bazooka-equipped L-4 in addition to the dozens destroyed by artillery he directed, became a symbol of American innovation and adaptation. His modification of the observation aircraft into an attack platform demonstrating the flexibility and initiative that characterized American forces, his success inspiring other L-4 pilots to experiment with offensive armament, though most remained focused on their primary observation mission, which provided far greater battlefield impact than direct attack, the ability to direct tons of artillery onto enemy positions within minutes far exceeding what any light aircraft could carry in ordnance. His aircraft, Rosie the Rocketer, became famous throughout Third Army, its distinctive profile with 6 bazookas mounted on the wings striking fear into German tank crews who knew that even if the bazookas didn't get them, the artillery certainly would. Carpenter's reputation spreading through German ranks as a pilot who seemed to have supernatural ability to find and destroy German armor, though in reality his greatest contribution was the systematic destruction of German forces through directed artillery fire rather than his more famous bazooka attacks. The L-4 Grasshoppers' contribution to Allied victory extended beyond measurable battlefield statistics to fundamental changes in how ground warfare was conducted. The compression of the sensor-shooter loop from hours to minutes, the elevation of artillery from supporting arm to decisive weapon, the integration of air and ground observation into a seamless system, the democratization of fire support where any soldier could call for and receive artillery support, the psychological impact of constant observation and instant retribution, all combining to create a form of warfare that Axis forces were neither prepared for nor capable of countering with their existing doctrine and organization. The German Wehrmacht, which had revolutionized warfare with blitzkrieg tactics in 1940, found itself facing an American Revolution in 1944 that was just as profound, the integration of artillery observation aircraft into organic battalion structures, creating a capability that transcended the sum of its parts, that leveraged American advantages in production, training, and communication into decisive battlefield superiority that no amount of tactical skill or individual courage could overcome. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 would provide final confirmation of L-4 effectiveness even in the worst possible conditions, where winter weather grounded most aircraft, where surprise and initial German success created chaos in American lines, where traditional observation posts were overrun or cut off. L-4 Grasshoppers still managed to fly in conditions that should have made operations impossible, their pilots navigating by following roads and railways barely visible through snow and fog, landing on icy roads and snow-covered fields, maintaining artillery observation that helped stop the German offensive despite its initial success. Their presence allowing American artillery to engage German spearheads even when ground observers were blind, their reports providing commanders with the only reliable intelligence on German movements in the confused opening days of the battle. German commanders reported that even in their moment of greatest success, when surprise and weather had negated most American advantages, the damned L-4 Grasshoppers were still overhead, still calling in artillery, still making movement in daylight dangerous, contributing to the rapid exhaustion of German fuel supplies as vehicles were forced to take longer covered routes to avoid observation, the delay allowing American reinforcements to arrive and ultimately defeat the last major German offensive of the war. The production statistics revealed the scale of American commitment to artillery observation, with one L-4 produced for every 800 soldiers in the American military, a ratio that ensured every artillery battalion, every division, every corps would have organic observation capability. The industrial might of America transformed into battlefield dominance through organizational innovation that multiplied the effectiveness of existing weapons rather than seeking technological silver. Bullets, the 20,000 L-4s produced representing not just aircraft but a system of warfare that integrated industry, training, doctrine, and technology into a capability that exceeded anything Axis powers could imagine, much less match. The German aircraft industry, despite producing technically superior aircraft like the FW-190 and Me-262, never grasped that quantity had a quality of its own when properly employed, that 20,000 simple observation aircraft integrated into artillery battalions provided more battlefield impact than 1,000 advanced fighters operating independently, that organizational innovation could overcome technological superiority when properly implemented. The legacy of the L-4 Grasshopper extended beyond World War II to influence military doctrine for generations, the concept of organic aviation assets, the integration of observation and fires, the compression of decision cycles, the importance of persistent surveillance, all lessons learned from the employment of a simple civilian aircraft adapted for military use, proving that innovation in warfare isn't always about advanced technology but often about finding new ways to employ existing capabilities, about organizational adaptation rather than technical revolution, about systematic integration rather than individual excellence. Modern military forces with their drones and precision weapons are following paths first blazed by L-4 pilots directing artillery onto German tanks. The basic concept of persistent observation linked to responsive fires remaining constant despite technological change. The lesson that seeing and shooting faster than the enemy remains the key to battlefield success, whether using fabric-covered aircraft with radios or satellites linked to guided missiles. The final German assessment of American artillery effectiveness, compiled from prisoner interrogations and captured documents after the war, concluded that the L-4 Grasshopper had been the single most important factor in American artillery superiority, that its organic assignment to artillery battalions had eliminated the delays inherent in requesting air support, that its persistent presence over the battlefield had provided continuous observation that no amount of camouflage or concealment could defeat, that its integration into the fire direction system had compressed response times to levels that made traditional defensive tactics obsolete, that its psychological impact had been as significant as its military effectiveness, creating a sense of helplessness and inevitability that corroded morale and contributed to German defeat. Japanese assessments were even more stark, declaring that the L-4 Grasshopper had made traditional positional warfare impossible, that its ability to direct naval gunfire and artillery had negated Japanese defensive advantages in prepared positions, that the only effective counter would have been air superiority to shoot down the observation aircraft. But by the time the Japanese recognized the threat, it was too late. American production and training programs ensuring that losses were immediately replaced, that the observation coverage was continuous and unbreaking. As Hauptmann Kleist sat in the prisoner of war camp, his war ended by American artillery directed by an aircraft he had dismissed as a toy, he reflected on how completely the Wehrmacht had misunderstood the nature of modern warfare, how their focus on individual weapon superiority had blinded them to American systematic superiority, how their rigid organizational structure had prevented them from adapting to American innovations, how their contempt for simple solutions had caused them to miss the revolutionary impact of putting artillery observers in cheap aircraft, how their emphasis on offensive warfare had left them unprepared for an enemy who could see everything and strike anything within minutes. His fellow prisoners, other veterans of Arracourt and subsequent battles, shared similar reflections, men who had thought themselves masters of modern warfare discovering they were fighting the last war while the Americans had invented a new one, their Panthers and Tigers impressive but irrelevant against an enemy who could destroy them from beyond visual range within minutes of detection, their tactical excellence meaningless when American artillery could break up attacks before they began, their courage and skill insufficient against an enemy who had revolutionized the very nature of ground combat through organizational innovation and systematic integration. The Italian officers among the prisoners, veterans of Sicily and the Italian campaign, could only nod in recognition, having experienced the same destruction, the same helplessness, the same gradual realization that they were not just outgunned but conceptually defeated, fighting with methods and doctrine that belonged to an earlier era against an enemy who had created something entirely new, not through technological breakthrough but through organizational innovation that transformed existing technology into decisive capability, the L-4 Grasshopper being the perfect symbol of American pragmatism. Taking a civilian training aircraft and turning it into the most feared aircraft over the battlefield not through armor or weapons but through integration into a system that multiplied its impact beyond anything its designers could have imagined. They remembered the terror of hearing that distinctive engine note overhead, knowing that within minutes, sometimes less, American artillery would begin falling with an accuracy that seemed guided by supernatural forces, their carefully prepared positions, their camouflaged guns, their concealed reserves all equally vulnerable to observation from above and the steel rain that inevitably followed. The Japanese liaison officer attached to German headquarters, one of the few to survive the war and captivity, would write in his memoirs that the L-4 Grasshopper represented everything the Axis powers had failed to understand about American military capability, that it wasn't about individual heroism or superior technology but about systematic organization and integration, about turning adequate equipment into superior capability through doctrine and training, about leveraging industrial capacity. Not just for production but for innovation, about creating military effectiveness through organizational excellence rather than tactical brilliance. Lessons that Japan had learned too late in the Pacific where L-4 Grasshoppers had turned island battles into one-sided slaughters where Japanese forces were destroyed by artillery they couldn't see directed by aircraft they couldn't reach. He noted with bitter irony that while Germany and Japan had pursued wonder weapons and super soldiers, America had won the war with mass-produced training aircraft flown by artillery officers with abbreviated flight training, that while the Axis powers had emphasized quality over quantity, the Americans had achieved both through organizational innovation that multiplied the effectiveness of every weapon system, that while Germany and Japan had separated their military services into rival fiefdoms, America had integrated theirs into a combined arms team where a fabric-covered aircraft could direct the fires of an entire corps artillery onto a single target within 3 minutes of detection. The mathematics were irrefutable and horrifying to German military professionals who had prided themselves on tactical excellence. American artillery directed by L-4 Grasshoppers achieving a response time of 3 minutes from target identification to rounds on target, German artillery requiring 10 to 12 minutes under ideal conditions and often much longer in combat situations, meaning American forces could execute 3 to 4 fire missions in the time it took German artillery to execute 1. The multiplication of effectiveness meaning a single American artillery battalion with L-4 observation could deliver more effective fire than an entire German artillery regiment relying on ground observation. The integration of multiple battalions through fire direction centers allowing Americans to mass the fires of dozens or hundreds of guns onto single targets within minutes while German artillery remained tied to battery-level control and manual coordination that took hours to organize. The revolution wasn't in the artillery pieces themselves. American 105mm and 155mm howitzers were comparable to German equipment, but in the system that employed them, the observation that directed them, the communications that linked them, the procedures that controlled them, the organization that integrated them into a weapon of unprecedented effectiveness that transformed artillery from a supporting arm into the dominant force on the battlefield. The final irony was that Germany had possessed all the components necessary to create a similar system. The Fieseler Fi 156 Storch was superior to the L-4 Grasshopper as an observation aircraft. German radios were adequate for artillery communication. German artillery was technically proficient and well-trained. German officers understood the value of aerial observation. But the rigid organizational structure of the Wehrmacht, the separation between Luftwaffe and Heer, the emphasis on offensive warfare over systematic superiority, the focus on technological solutions over organizational innovation, all prevented Germany from integrating these components into an effective system, leaving them to fight a modern war with obsolete methods against an enemy who had revolutionized ground combat through the simple expedient of putting artillery observers in light aircraft and giving them radios to direct fire. The L-4 Grasshopper had indeed called lightning from the sky, but it was a lightning that struck with precision and purpose, directed by observers who could see the entire battlefield and delivered by an artillery system that could respond in minutes rather than hours, a combination that transformed warfare and doomed any force that faced it without similar capabilities. The German Wehrmacht, the Imperial Japanese Army, and the Italian military all learning too late that, in modern warfare, seeing and shooting faster than the enemy mattered more than any amount of courage, skill, or technological superiority in individual weapons. The story of the L-4 Grasshopper was ultimately a story of American innovation and adaptation, of taking a simple civilian aircraft and transforming it into a weapon system that revolutionized warfare, of recognizing that organizational excellence could overcome technological superiority, that integration mattered more than individual capability, that systematic approach could defeat tactical brilliance, lessons written in the burning hulks of German tanks at Arracourt, in the destroyed Japanese positions on Pacific Islands, in the shattered Italian defenses in Sicily, all victims of an enemy they never saw who could bring death from the sky within minutes of detection. The small fabric-covered aircraft with their puttering engines becoming angels of death that announced the arrival of American artillery with devastating accuracy and unprecedented speed, forever changing the nature of ground combat and proving that in warfare, innovation isn't always about advanced technology but often about finding new ways to employ simple solutions to complex problems.